Bone Wars. So today's video might be a bit long because there's a lot to talk about, and like any war, it's all about the tactics and the battles and the punches and the attacks and all those things. So it can get quite complicated. So bear with me as we go through this blow by blow account of what happened in the Bone Wars back in the American West and in the American East from 1872 through to 1892. So the Bone Wars were waged by Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh. And they were both the high point and the low point in the science of paleontology. Between the two of them, they collected and classified 142 new species at the time, mostly from the fantastically rich bone beds of the Morrison Formation. Although today only 32 of those species are valid, but at the time they collected and named that many dinosaurs, or they thought they had collected and named that many species, but we'll talk about that later on in the video. So from initial friendship to outright war, they battled it out in the newspapers, the scientific journals, and in the wild badlands of Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. And so who won the Bone Wars? Well, you're going to have to stick around to the end to find out. It's not as simple as we might like to think it is. So Othniel Charles Marsh was the head of paleontology at the Museum of Natural History at Yale, and Edward Drinker Cope was the head of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. Weapons of war included bribery, theft, dynamite, stone throwing, and spying. They also attacked each other in the scientific journals and in the popular press in an attempt to destroy each other's reputations. They didn't seem to care about the money, so Cope actually bankrupted himself financing fossil hunting expeditions. So in trying to disgrace each other, they disgraced themselves. Other famous paleontologists of the time refused to work with them and refused to be drawn into the battle and left it to Cope and Marsh. And yet, in spite of all the skullduggery and the madness, they left behind a legacy which lives on to this day. And so some of the dinosaurs which we love so much were found by these two men in their quest for the top paleontological hotspot, driven by their intense rivalry and hatred for one another. So if we haven't met before, my name is Gerald Davey and I am the Dino Man. I head up the DinoZone, where we bring all things dinosaur to you, dinosaur fan that you are. So please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, please share, because it's good for the algorithm, it's good for me, but more importantly, it's good for you. Remember to visit us at www.thedinozone.com for our written dinosaur diaries and updates on developments at the DinoZone. So the link is in the description below. And then there's the Facebook page where also up to the minute stuff gets put up, and our Instagram account. And those links are also in the description. And then why not grab our free coloring book, which is on the DinoZone website. And I'll leave that link. So I think there's 30 or 40 pages in there of amazing drawings of creatures from the Mesozoic, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Fun stuff for the kids. A little bit stylized, but that just adds an extra dimension to it. There's some real kind of dynamic, beautiful pictures of T-Rexes and raptors and all that kind of stuff. And so you have free reign to paint the Mesozoic or color the Mesozoic any color you want. Right, so let's get back to the Bone Wars. I do have to wonder, I must say, I do have to wonder what our two paleontologists could have achieved if they'd combined their skills and their resources in their quest for dinosaurs rather than using their energy in hating one another. But it might have been that hatred that was the catalyst that drove them to achieve what they did. And without it, the outcomes might have been very different. So from our point of view, their rivalry sparked the public's interest in dinosaurs and prehistoric life, which has not died since those mad days back in the late 1800s. So Cope met Marsh in Berlin on a scientific conference in 1864, and initially they were great mates. They hung out with each other for several days, and in the first great paleontological love-in, they named dinosaurs after each other. Both were larger-than-life characters with strong, very strong personalities. Both liked a good fight, and both distrusted everybody. So Cope came from a wealthy family with good family ties, which allowed him to study to become a naturalist and ultimately professor of Haverford College. Whereas Marsh, on the other hand, came from a more humble background, but his uncle, George Peabody, had parts of money. And so Marsh managed to get Uncle George to stump up the funds to build the Peabody Museum of Natural History, and of course, got himself appointed as the head of the museum. No surprises there. Perhaps Cope was a bit of a snob and looked down his nose at Marsh due to his humble background. Who knows? But it all started to go wrong when Cope took Marsh to a mile pit in New Jersey to show him some hadrosaur bones. So this was one of the first dinosaur finds in North America. And of course, both of our protagonists were quite excited about this. But little did they realize, or anybody else for that matter, how it was all going to end in terms of the bone wars and in terms of the number of dinosaurs that North America actually yielded up, because the first finds had been in Europe. So after visiting the mile pit, they parted as friends, but then Marsh did a dirty. He did a dirty thing. He went back to the quarry and he paid the pit operators to send all future finds to him instead of to Cope. So that was a dodgy thing to do. So my sympathies lie with Cope on this one. So it was very underhand, and Cope's anger was understandable. And things went rapidly downhill after that, and the two began to attack each other in the scientific publications. And so one of the opening salvos of the war was when Cope was publicly humiliated by Marsh, who pointed out that Cope had put the head of a plesiosaur, a Lasmosaurus, onto the tail of the animal. And here's a picture of the reconstruction, Cope's mistaken reconstruction of the Lasmosaurus. So Lasmosaurus had a very long neck and a short tail, but I think Cope understandably couldn't work that one out. Normally the tail is quite long, so he stuck the head on the wrong end of the animal, which was, to Marsh's glee, was just the most fantastic thing for attacking Cope over. And so that's where it all started out. And then back in the 1870s, word came out of the American West that fossils were being dug up. So this, of course, attracted the attention of our two bone hunters, and Cope managed to get a position at the US Geological Survey, which allowed him officially to go fossil hunting. June 1872 found Cope on his first trip to the bone beds of Wyoming. The famous American paleontologist or naturalist of the time, Joseph Leidy, was angered by this, as he considered that to be his turf. So he formally made a complaint to the head of the Geological Survey, Hayden, and as a result, Leidy and Hayden fell out with each other. And needless to say, Leidy fell out with Cope. Back then, bringing fossils back east was quite an undertaking. And remember that there were no roads, or the roads were rudimentary. There were no cranes, there were no trucks, there were no forklifts, there were no telephones to assist. So it was all just human power, grunt work, and animal-drawn carts. So Cope, thanks to his position in the Geological Survey, was relying on assistance from his employees, but this failed to turn up. So he had to find his own crew to get the bones home. But then it turns out that his new employees actually worked for Marsh, and so the plot thickened. However, the great irony was that Marsh didn't know that his employees were working for Cope. So he was outraged when he heard the news that his new recruits were also working for his rival. Clearly these two men were scallywags and were happy to collect two salaries from our great rivals. They spun Marsh's story that they had gone to work for Cope to lead him away from the best fossils, or the best fossil sites. So it goes, eh? It gets better and better as time goes by here, as the story unfolds. So Cope met with success on his expeditions, crossing some wild country where he found dozens of new species. Meanwhile, one of Marsh's men accidentally forwarded some of his material to Cope, who then, in a gentlemanly way, sent it back to Marsh. But that was the end of their relationship, and it continued to go downhill thereafter. So by the spring of 1872, it was open war. Leidy, Cope and Marsh were digging up bones at a furious rate, shipping them back home and constantly announcing new species. So the problem was they were all digging up the same creature, the same species, but each one was giving them their own names, with little regard to the fact that these species had already been classified. The rule is that the scientist who first describes a species gets to name it, and so the war continued in the scientific journals. Marsh won this battle of the larger war as more of his names were valid than Cope's names. The pile of bones grew ever higher. Whilst the scientists fought it out in the publications, they continued their fossil hunting out west, with Marsh making his last Yale finance trip in 1873 with a group of students and soldiers who came along in a show of force. After that, Marsh stayed at home and paid local collectors to do the hard digging for him. Lazy boy. And the pile of bones grew ever higher, and he was running a backlog of bones or fossils or skeletons that needed to be described in the scientific papers. That didn't stop him collecting, though. His appetite for bones never went away. Cope, too, was collecting and brought home more fossils than he had in the previous year. Marsh had more feet on the ground, though, and Cope had to work around Marsh's crew, who were understandably unwelcoming of his team. Cope also left the Geological Survey and found work at the Army Corps of Engineers, which forced him to tag along on their expeditions and journeys and their surveys rather than dig where he wanted to dig. Dakota, 1875. Gold is discovered in the Black Hills, and tensions between the Native Americans and the United States government was at an all-time high. This was inconvenient to Marsh, as those bone beds lay right where the tensions were being played out. So Marsh became a politician and a businessman, agreeing to pay Chief Red Cloud of the Sioux for any bones that he dug up. He also promised to lobby for the Sioux in Washington against their ill treatment, which he, give him his due, he actually did do. So well done to Marsh on that front. And so here's a picture of Marsh and his crew. Hey, what a bunch of ruffians. It's a great pic, though. Look at those guys with their guns. So Marsh is the dude in the middle, in the back, with a big beard. So Como Bluff is arguably the sacred ground of paleontology. Mention the word Como Bluff in the Morrison Formation to any red-blooded paleontologist and their eyes will light up, because it is one of the most prolific bone beds in the history of vertebrate paleontology, having yielded more bones than any other formation in the history of the science. So I made another video on the Morrison Formation, so somewhere here, I'm not sure where we'll have the link, somewhere up here, there'll be the link where you can click through and watch that, or that video that focuses exclusively on the Morrison Formation. So back in 1877, a geologist called Arthur Lakes wrote to Marsh saying that he had found massive bones sticking out of a rock face when on a hike near the town of Morrison. And in his letter, he correctly deduced that they were a vertebra and a humerus of some gigantic saurian. He then dug up some bones and sent them to New Haven to Marsh, and he also sent a shipment to Cope. Fair enough, eh? So it makes me think that Cope and Marsh were quite well known back in the day, because every bone that was found and every discovery that someone made, those two guys were written to or they were sent samples. So they seem to have little difficulty in knowing who or where to send the samples. So Marsh took his time in replying to Lakes, but sent $100 anyway to keep his find a secret. But it was too late, the cat was out of the bag, and so Marsh sent his field collector Mudge to Morrison to secure the spot and get Lakes onto his payroll. And Marsh's quick work, after quite a slow start, secured Lakes' services, who wrote to Cope saying that all the bones would in future be shipped to Marsh. Ouch for Cope. And so here's a picture of Como Bluff as it is today. And this is where it all starts getting complicated. Trying to keep track of who was who in the battle and what they did. It's like any war, it's always a messy business, and then the historians have to try and work out what happened afterwards. So life has its funny twists and turns. So Cope received a letter from a Mr. O.W. Lucas. This is after he'd been done it, well, he'd got a letter from Lake saying that all the discoveries would be going to Marsh. So Cope received a letter from O.W. Lucas, a naturalist who had been collecting plants near Cannon City, Colorado. And guess what was in the letter? Well, there's no prizes for guessing. He had found a pile of old bones. And then some samples arrived, and Cope concluded they were the bones of large herbivores. Marsh, never one to miss a trick, then sent Mudge and his student assistant Williston to steal the find from Cope by setting up a bone quarry near Cannon. However, Lucas refused to work for Marsh and nailed his banner to Cope's mast. So back to Morrison when Williston, who was nearly then killed as his bone quarry collapsed. Poor Williston, he was in the wars. And this would have been the end of Marsh's supply of bones, but then a third letter arrived to save the day. At the time, they were building the transcontinental railway through the wildlands of Wyoming, and the letter was signed by Harlow and Edwards. Gets complicated now. Remember the name Harlow and Edwards, whose real names were actually Carlin and Reed. And remember the names Carlin and Reed. And they claimed that they'd found plenty of fossils in Como Bluff, another source of dinosaurs. Williston, that willing but tired workhorse of Marsh, was sent back to Como Bluff to find out what was going on, and he confirmed that indeed there were plenty of bones elsewhere in the bluff. Money was sent to Harlow and Edwards, alternatively known as Carlin and Reed, I'm not sure what to call them, to keep them bone hunting. They had a problem cashing the checks, as Marsh had made them out to Harlow and Edwards and not their real names. So there's a lesson in that somewhere. I can imagine the arguments in the bank and the letters going back and forth to solve that little problem. They eventually went to meet Marsh personally and managed to get contracts drawn up for ongoing bone collecting. And it seems like bone collecting was far more fun and better paid than working on the transcontinental railroad. And so here's a cross-section of the geology of Como Bluff, and you can see the folded sediments and where the actual bone beds lay in that formation. Carlin and Reed weren't too happy about the agreed terms, so once again trouble was brewing in the bone wars. However, Como Bluff and surrounds began to produce some amazing fossils, and Marsh received shed loads of bones via the new railroad throughout 1877. And this is when some of the most famous dinosaurs, which we all love so much, were first described. Names like Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, and Apatosaurus. It seems like there were no honest or honorable men in those crazy days. It was indeed the Wild West. Perhaps they were just following the lead of their respective bosses, who weren't entirely honorable either. So word of the prolific finds spread, and Carlin and Reed informed the press of their finds, and an article in the Laramie Daily Sentinel informed the world of the discoveries and inflated the prices that were being paid for the bones that were being dug up there. It's the usual story, hey? Prospectors have been doing that for years, mineral gold prospectors, exaggerating the richness and the value of mineral deposits and their finds. So not to be squeezed out of the bone bonanza, Cope sent dinosaur rustlers out to Como to steal fossils from Marsh. I guess when you have to employ scallywags to do your dirty work for you, you can't always rely on their honesty and their loyalty. Carlin also became fed up with Marsh's slow payments, and he went to work for Cope. Reed stayed on with Marsh. So for 15 years, both sides battled the weather and each other. They sabotaged the digs, they obstructed each other. Reed and Carlin fell out with one another too, not surprisingly, as they were now in enemy camps. Once Carlin locked Reed out of the Como train station, which forced him to crate bones in bitterly cold winter weather. Under Cope's direction, Carlin opened up his own bone quarry in Como Bluff, with Reed spying on his former colleague under Marsh's orders. Marsh's quarries began to run out of bones, and so Reed destroyed the remaining bones rather than have them fall into enemy hands, which is typical tactics of war, destroying the things to prevent them from falling into the enemy camp. Lakes, who we'd met earlier and wrote the first letter to Marsh and to Cope about the discoveries at Cannon, were sent by Marsh to assist with the excavations, and Marsh actually took some time out now to pay the quarries a visit. So more quarries were opened up, but by this time in Lakes where Carlin were not talking, and both resigned. Things got worse as new recruits fell out with each other, and that old stalwart of Marsh's, Williston, resigning and going to work for Cope. How the world had changed. And then other parties began to come out west to hunt for bones, including Professor Alexander Agassiz of Harvard. So competition was on the increase. In good American business tradition, Carlin and Williston founded a bone company to sell fossils to the highest bidder. Reed left his bone digging career and became a shepherd. Clearly a far less stressful job than scrapping it out in the bone wars, and Marsh's Como quarries yield little after his departure. Marsh was winning the quarry battle with more operational quarries than Cope. Cope at the time was drowning in fossils back home, but was technically losing the bone wars. The two men continued to fight it out, accusing each other of spying, stealing, and bribery. On one occasion, their teams threw rocks at each other. It does all seem quite laughable now, but tensions were clearly running high out there in the bone-strewn battlefields of the American West. They say the pen is mightier than the sword, and it was in the scientific journals that the war was really fought out. Remember Cope's mistake of putting the head of Elasmosaurus on his tail? Well, he tried to buy up every copy of that scientific journal where he had made that mistake to remove his error from the public record. Leidy had made the same error too, so it wasn't just Cope who was subject to those kinds of mistakes. Cope was a prolific writer. He actually wrote more scientific papers than Marsh. So he produced piles of scientific papers, and Marsh took pleasure at sniping at him from the sidelines every time he found an error in Cope's work. But Marsh wasn't also totally immune from making mistakes either. He erroneously put the wrong skull on Apatosaurus and declared a new genus, which he called Brontosaurus. However, people began to tire of this mad battle, and by the late 1880s, most of the interest in the fight had waned. Marsh landed a position as head of the Geological Survey, whilst Cope struggled to pay his bills. Marsh was well connected, so he used his contacts to block Cope from getting work in various universities and government departments. So Cope struggled financially and invested in silver mines, which initially did well until the bottom fell out of the silver market. Marsh has always remained a bad player and gave little credit to his loyal workers for the finds and scientific contributions which they had made to the science of paleontology. And so eventually Williston and others moved on to greener pastures. Cope befriended Henry Field Osborne, who was professor of anatomy at Princeton and very influential. And there had been some shenanigans within the Geological Survey with Marsh and Powell, who was the head of the unit, being implicated in some dodgy dealings. And so Cope went to the papers with a journal on which he had kept a record of all Marsh's dodgy dealings within the Geological Survey. And so the battle was taken to the newspapers, with accusations and counter-accusations being leveled at each other. And at the end of it, both paleontologists' reputations were in tatters. All right, we're nearly done here now. It's been back and forth and back and forth. Thank you for sticking with us. And so other paleontologists were also fed up with the behavior of these two men and were equally fed up to see their names being dragged into print by both Marsh and Cope. At the end, no one was the winner. Eventually, Powell had to answer to his bosses as to where all the monies had gone, and as a result demanded Marsh's resignation and severed ties with him. Marsh's influence began to wane as some of his old cronies retired or passed away. Cope had by this stage landed a job at the University of Pennsylvania, which helped him get his finances back on track. And then he went on to work for the Texas Geological Survey and eventually got Leidy's job as professor of zoology. He was then elected president of the National Association for the Advancement of Science, just as Marsh stepped down as head of the Academy of Sciences. So who won the Bone Wars? Well, at the end of the day, Marsh had discovered 80 new dinosaurs and Cope 56. If we only look at it in those terms, then Marsh won the war. But it ultimately boiled down to money, and Marsh had more of it than Cope. Cope, however, was more the academic, with a wider range of paleontological interests, while Marsh just chased down bones of reptiles and mammals. And Cope actually wrote, I can't remember the number, but he was a phenomenal producer of scientific papers, so he really cranked them out, way more than Marsh. And once the dust had settled, some of the most well-known dinosaurs, including species of Triceratops, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, I get different pronunciations, Stegosaurus, Camarasaurus, and Coelophysis had been described. And they'd driven the science of paleontology to dizzying heights, particularly in view of the fact that only 9 dinosaurs had been discovered before the Bone Wars. All the twists and turns of this sorry saga are quite hard to follow, which is what happens in times of war. Both and Marsh came up with a whole bunch of different theories, some of which have gone into the rubbish bin. One notable one that Marsh came up with, or supported the idea, he wasn't the first to moot the idea, that birds were descended from dinosaurs, and that theory still holds water to this day. The Bone Wars did get the public interested in the discoveries and the dinosaurs and the exhibits that were put together and that popped up in the museums, and that fascination is yet to go extinct to this day. In fact, the world is completely in love with dinosaurs. This whole DinoZone, dinosaur podcast, videos, and having fun with it, because there's an ongoing interest and people are fascinated. So well done to you for sticking through to the end of this story. You would make a good paleontologist because it takes staying power to go and find bones and dig them up and cart them back to the laboratory. So hats off to you for that. And to conclude, that famous paleontologist Robert T. Bakker stated, the dinosaurs that came from Como Bluff not only filled museums, they filled magazine articles, textbooks, they filled people's minds. And so that's the last shot to be fired in the Bone Wars saga, in this video anyway. So remember to like this video, please share this video, please subscribe to the Dinosaur Diaries, the DinoZone, and click that notification button, because it's good for the algorithm, it's good for me, but more importantly, it's good for you. And remember the Facebook page, remember the Instagram page, remember the DinoZone website where we put blogs up and all sorts of stuff about dinosaurs. And that's the end of that. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.